Brett Ryan was a charismatic, popular, good-looking young man who was just weeks away from marrying the woman of his dreams. He had a waterfront condo, and to those who knew him, he seemed to have a successful career and an amazing future ahead of him. But as the saying goes, all that glitters is not gold, and what lies beneath the shiny, smiling exterior can be very dark indeed. This is what happens when a desperate man will go to extreme lengths in order to cover up a simple lie. This is the case of the Crossbow Killer. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me. Today's case is one that challenges a few things. For example, there is a bias in society, isn't there? If something looks good, it must be good. It's highly inaccurate, as we know. But nonetheless, it really intrigues me as to how this plays out legally. You'll know what I mean as I go through today's video. Also, thanks for joining me. If you're new to this channel, of course, if you're a returner, thanks as ever. But my content is released on a Wednesday and a Sunday. It's always deep dive. It's always consistent. So if you like crime and consistency, then this is the channel for you. If you haven't subscribed and you like my stuff, please do get your notifications on, because I'm going to be dropping some other videos that are not necessarily on my normal Wednesday, Sunday timeline, because I just want to give you some extras. So if you fancy that, make sure you are subscribed and you've got those notifications on so you will be told when I'm doing so. Also, to those of you who are supporting me on YouTube membership and Patreon, thank you. I can't make this without you. Let's get on with today's case. This is one of those that, again, astonishes you because you can't see it coming, essentially. And we know that lots of crimes occur where the victim is completely unaware that it's going to play out. That goes without saying. That's why people end up victims. But there is something expected, something within our lives that we feel that we can absolutely rely on. And that takes the form often of family. This case is going to show you just how wrong people can be when it comes down to the alliances and allegiances that we often believe we have around us. Let's talk about Bill and Sue Ryan, the parents in this case. They had 4 sons, so a relatively big family, and also boys, all boys. So we can imagine that the household would be a busy one. They had Chris, Leyland, Brett, and Alexander, who was known as AJ. The family lived in Scarborough, Ontario, in a really quiet and peaceful neighbourhood on Lawndale Road. And Bill, he had worked as a budget manager at the Toronto Star. He was also somebody who was very active in the local community on a fitness level, so he led exercise classes at the community centre. And Sue, she was a matriarch. She was a stay-at-home mum. She was somebody who was very passionate about the outdoors. She loved gardening, and she genuinely maintained the garden of the family home to an incredible standard. And the couple were really proud of their home. They were very proud of their wonderful sons, in spite of their idiosyncrasies, because every child is a blessing, but every child comes with their own unique gifts and also their own unique problems. Chris, their eldest son, he'd worked as a toll collector since 2004. He was quite shy around new people, but it was said that when he came out of his shell, he was somebody who was kind of goofy. He was somebody who was a lot of fun. Leyland was said to be really artistic. He enjoyed photography. He had a real talent for restoring vintage cabinets. And he was really passionate about music. He was very gifted. He played both the drums and the guitar. AJ, well, he was super gifted, academically excellent. He actually attended a school for gifted and talented students. He was said to be really deeply conscientious and incredibly studious. And then there's Brett. Now, Brett, he was considered to be attractive. I would say that is the thing that for most people stood out. He was described as very charismatic, very outgoing, very extroverted. That's in contrast, realistically, to his other brothers. They were all more introverted on that scale. He was also said to be a very gregarious individual, very polite, very compassionate, very generous. He actually acted as a referee for Little League games at the local community centre. He even volunteered at Sick Kids. So he's somebody who's very much involved pro-socially in the community. He, in 1997, graduated from Sir Oliver Mowat High School, but I would say, according to sources, he wasn't somebody who had a very clear direction in life. He didn't quite know what he wanted to do. And I think that when you're a young person, the idea of making decisions about your future is ridiculous. It's ludicrous, isn't it? Most of us, at least in the Western world, will have probably experienced that moment in school where a careers officer comes in and gives a talk, and maybe you get to sit down with that careers officer and have a discussion about where you want your life to take you. And basically, there are like four careers that are offered. Like, do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or work in science? You know, they're the things that kind of come out. And logistically, they don't tell you about any of the bazillion other jobs that you could do without having to have a credit or qualification to your name. But we've been there, we've gone through it. It's stupid. The idea that at 15, 16, 17, 18, even 20, you really know who you're going to be and what you want to do. Ludicrous. Puts a lot of pressure on kids they don't need. But fundamentally, it does lead to a lot of young people feeling that if they haven't got this idea of direction, they're doing something wrong. They're anchorless, when in fact they're just finding out who they are. And it's completely typical to feel those feelings. Those who knew him, they said that he did suffer bouts of depression, but he was one of those people who wouldn't talk about that. He wouldn't actually suggest that he was struggling. He would try to pretend he was okay, even when he wasn't okay. And the quote that I lifted was that he wished to be admired as opposed to pitied. I think anybody who's struggled with anxiety, depression, mental health issues will relate to that. Very often, owning the fact that you are struggling is incredibly challenging. And also, believing that people will think lesser of you when you acknowledge that can be a real limiter to being open and honest. And when you're not open and honest, that can also lead you to doing things that are not good for you, because essentially you're feeling that you are pressured to act a certain way, even when really you don't have the emotional resources and bandwidth to do it. So he is somebody who has his problems, but for the most part, he's very well loved. He's got a very supportive family. And to all intents and purposes, his life should be working towards a really bright future. Brett begins studying at the University of Toronto, but he didn't find it easy. So he finds this relatively difficult and he drops out, which is going to be something that's difficult to deal with. At the end of the day, we all believe our life is going to be linear. We often believe that because, shall we say, our brothers or sisters have gone down a certain path, we'll do the same and it'll all work out. And the psychology of recognizing that this isn't working in the way that you'd assumed can be really challenging for you to manage. And dropping out is a sense of failure. So ultimately, that's going to have knocked his self-confidence, self-esteem, and also potentially added and exacerbated those mental health issues. He's also living at his parents' home at the time, so he's not moving forward in his life to any great shape as far as he's concerned. And so he doesn't know how to deal with this situation, but he does know that he needs to make some money. So he starts basically working as a painter and decorator for a living. So he's painting people's houses. And whilst he does a good job painting houses, it doesn't make a lot of money. It's not the most lucrative career for him. So he starts having money troubles. And despite the fact that he's living with his parents, and that would mean that he's not paying a huge amount of rent, and he's likely getting his meals cooked and his washing done because that's what mums tend to do, he doesn't want to admit that that's his lifestyle. He wants to suggest that he has more, so he likes to spend his money that he earns on really nice things that he can't afford, basically. So he's buying really expensive designer clothing, he buys a brand new car, which to anybody with an ounce of sense would not do. Because if you buy a new car, the minute you take it off the forecourt, it's diminished substantially in value. So essentially, you're just hemorrhaging money. You buy a second-hand car, maybe a couple of years with a low mileage, and then you're actually looking after your money. You get a good-looking car, you get it for a lot less, and that means that you can still appear successful without the hefty price tag, but that's not what he wants to do. And when we think about somebody's self-esteem, we often will note that when they have problems with that, they'll do things that are actually going to cause themselves issue. Because if you're looking after your self-esteem, if you have a sense of self-value, then you don't put yourself in precarious situations. You manage your money effectively. He's not doing that. So he can't afford these trappings, but he's getting them anyway. He's trying to manage the hole within his psyche and self with materialistic possessions. And we all know, never works. Now, by 2007, because he's on this spending trajectory, he's got this really large sum of debt. That large sum of debt totaled over $60,000. And this is 2007. It's nearly 20 years ago. So think about money now versus then. We're talking probably the equivalent of $100,000. That's a huge amount of debt to have as a young person who hasn't actually totaled anything, hasn't actually managed to achieve a particular career and is therefore going to be able to pay all of this back. This is frivolous spending that's got him in this situation. It was also said that some of that debt had actually been in part as a result of unhealthy intimate relationships. So let's say intimate relationships that cost quite a bit of money. And good intimate relationships tend not to do that, particularly if you've not got the cash to spend. Usually, intimate partners are supportive, but in this case, whatever intimate liaisons he was having was busting the bank, so to speak. We get to October the 20th, 2007. This is when Brett has been through the mill financially. He's not achieved the place and space that he thought he'd be in at this point in his life. He's feeling resentful that he can see other people around him succeeding. He's feeling pressured because he believes that he should also be on a trajectory of success and he's not. So he figures, what do I do? How can I achieve cash and achieve cash quickly? So, totally left field, I would say, because when you think about Brett, he's not high criminalized past. He isn't somebody who's been having problems with the law ever before this day. But for some reason, he decides that the answer to his prayers is to go and rob a bank. I kid you not. He went to the CIBC bank on 371 Old Kingston Road. He wore a disguise, so not quite as stupid as some of the criminals that we've covered on my channel. He did actually think forensically about how to potentially get away with it. This included wearing bandages covering his face, and also he had openings for his eyes so he could see. He also wore his arm in a sling and he walked with a limp. So whilst he's going to draw attention to himself, because I don't know, somebody walked past me looking like a mummy, genuinely, like a mummy from the film Mummy, just wearing a jacket over it, because that's what somebody would look like with a completely bandaged body. He's obviously trying to look like he's injured, right? I get it. And he's also wearing a nifty disguise where nobody can actually see his face, but that would draw attention to anybody. Now, the bank that he robs is actually really close to his family home, so he's not thinking about distance. He's not thinking about how he could maybe get away with it more easily, more readily by leaving his home area and going elsewhere, because there's always ultimately that fear of being disguised because you're known in the area. But maybe he thought his disguise was just so effective, no one was going to clock. He goes over to the counter, shows the bank teller a note, and that note basically said to the teller that he had a gun and that he wanted at least $2,000. Now, he did leave successfully with $1,115. Makes sense. At the end of the day, if you're a bank teller, why are you going to risk your life with that low amount of money? Bank robbers come in and do heists of huge amounts. So yes, it's awful losing a certain amount of money for your bank, but when it's that lowball figure, you're likely going to find that people understand fully in management and that your life is worth way more. Your life is always worth way more, but you can understand why in that moment, even though that bank teller might have thought, well, maybe they aren't armed, maybe they aren't in a situation where they can harm me, they're not going to risk it for any amount of money. But also, like I said, he's quite clever in the fact that he'll know that the teller will only have a certain amount of money on them because they are aware that they don't want huge amounts and quantities of cash that they have access to, because that puts them in a more challenging position, makes them more at risk of these kind of things. So he's calculated this is a way of getting the cash without too much fuss and making a dash for it. Now, he realizes at this point, because it has been easy, it's been really easy for him to achieve this, he thinks, I'm just going to rob more banks. Now, the mindset of somebody who thinks that bank robbing is an easy win is really fractured. The truth is, most of us would be terrified shoplifting a Mars bar from Tesco. We just don't have that programming that says it's okay to do the things that involve taking somebody else's goods. But bank robbery is way up there. We're talking about organised crime mentality. We're talking about gang mentality. We're talking about highly dangerous human beings who think that it's acceptable, firstly, to traumatise other people by threatening them with their life, saying that if they don't do A, B or C, you're going to kill them. And also feeling that that is something that makes money really achievable for him and balancing it out that that's the right thing to do. That says something really dark about his nature. And he starts to get good at making sure that his disguise works. So he replaces the bandages over his face, because that's not going to take the police very long to figure out, is it? The police are going to be like, if we see anybody who's literally walking about like maybe it's Halloween, unless it's on Halloween, well, let's hope they don't do any burglaries and bank robberies on Halloween. That would be an issue. But aside from Halloween, anybody walking around completely bandaged up, maybe with a limp, maybe with an arm looking like it's in a sling, that's our guy. So he knows he's got to change his disguise. So he ends up buying a really realistic fake beard. That actually leads to the police referring to him as the fake beard bandit. And they believe that he robbed at least 12 more banks, all of them in close proximity to where he lived. And the reason mainly that he kept getting away with them was that, as I said, he had no criminal history. They don't expect the boy next door to just crack on robbing loads of banks if he hasn't been the boy next door who's also got an ASBO and has been banged up before in youth detention centres because he's a problem kid. That's not what Brett has been like. They haven't even got a fingerprint of him anywhere. So essentially, when they find fingerprints at the scene, there's no recordings of previous crimes with that fingerprint. He's never been arrested for anything, so they cannot connect him initially with the robberies. So the police have to resort to doing things like watching banks in the local area in an attempt to catch him, because it's a wait and see. Otherwise, they aren't going to be able to figure out who this man is, because, like I said, there's been no prior history. We get to the 20th of June 2008, and this is when Brett's bank robbery career ends. So he's caught by the police. He was basically about to rob another bank, didn't even have a weapon, and he actually denied that he'd ever had one whilst he was committing the robberies. What he actually did that day was he walked into the bank and kind of got a feeling that he was being watched. He didn't actually carry out that robbery, but the police apprehended him and then obviously found that his fingerprints matched and he was banged to rights, and that was the end of those robberies. Now, in total, they figured out that he'd stolen around $28,000, so he didn't steal a huge amount of money, but this is about him getting by as opposed to creating a crime empire, so to speak. But it's such a negligible amount of money when you think about the trauma that's been involved for all of those people who've believed that they are under threat of death, and that's what he was doing. Now, in 2009, we get to the court case. So it's January 2009. He's sat in this small windowless courtroom in the Ontario Court of Justice. At this point, of course, he pleads guilty to 8 of the bank robberies because he's banged to rights. Literally, his forensics were everywhere. His DNA were everywhere. There was no way he was ever going to get away with it. But his friends had been really supportive. They'd written loads of letters saying what a great guy he was. And he actually only got 5 years in prison, which is tiny. 8 bank robberies. Genuinely, it's breathtaking. I guarantee, guys, if he had been, shall we say, another ethnicity, if he had been somebody who came from a very poor background, if he had been somebody who had had a criminal history to this point, if he had been somebody who didn't look smiley, goofy, pretty good looking, and come across as eloquent, he would have got way longer. That bias and prejudice towards people who don't have pretty privilege, or to people who have got a different ethnicity than, in this case, a white middle-class boy, you're going to get a different reaction when it comes down to court. People can disagree with me. This channel invites and welcomes other people's opinions. But in my experience, and certainly what I see play out constantly in crimes, that would be the case. Now, prosecutors, because they understood the severity of a man who literally has robbed, as they believed, 12 different banks, traumatizing lots of people, they said, listen, he needs a 10-year sentence for his crimes. Now, the fact that they didn't get it and that they only got 5 years, to me, is breathtakingly short. It really is. You consider the amount of robberies, the amount of money stolen, the amount of people traumatized and upset, but no, apparently 5 years was enough. And what really blows my mind is what the judge talks about when he's talking about why he's given this sentence. So he's really sympathetic towards Brett, the bank robber. He said that Brett was a person of integrity. He called him a truly productive member of society, basically referencing his previous history and volunteering experience. And he described his actions as completely out of character. He said, "You are not a youth, but you, in my view, are youthful." Sorry, can we just rewind? So, you are not a youth, but in my view, you are youthful. Oh, right, okay, thanks. I do have quite a good skincare regime, and I think that moisturising is highly underrated when you think about the aging process. So I appreciate that. Yes, you are not a youth, but I think you're youthful. And is that kind of you suggesting that because I'm a bit childish, I haven't figured just how serious bank robbing is? I'm suggesting exactly that. Well done. It's because you're very clever. You're a clever you're an upstanding member of your community. I do feel that I've been quite upstanding. I've been a volunteer. You have. And it's not like any bad people ever were volunteers. No, I mean, I think you'll find Ted Bundy was a volunteer. He was a volunteer for a suicide prevention helpline. Well, yes, but Ted Bundy was another one. He was another one, wasn't he? He was so left field. I mean, when it comes down to it, Ted Bundy probably should have been a lawyer. Probably should have. I mean, that was a very sad detraction from where he could have ended up. Well, I agree completely. You should only give me 5 years. I'm going to, because you are an upstanding member of our community who's just gone a little bit wrong because he's just a little bit childish and youthful. You've got great hair. Thank you. I just use honey, almond, goat's milk. Sometimes I just use water and let it dry in the golden sun. I thought so. You're beautiful. I know that didn't play out exactly how it is, but that's how ludicrous it is. This guy's a bank robber. Just because you don't look like a bank robber, it isn't what you look like. It isn't what you look like in life that counts. You can be, shall we say, societally unattractive and be the most beautiful human being that has ever walked the earth. Equally, you can be absolutely gorgeous and be a hideous excuse for a human being. But no, not in this particular legal framework, apparently. Looks will demonstrate whether you're a person of worth or otherwise. Unbelievable. How can we talk about 8 separate robberies as being out of character? Surely there is a point where it becomes a habit. When it comes down to it, you don't make a mistake 8 times in a row of the same gravity and get better at it. That's the logistics of his crimes. For me, out of character would be one robbery done in an extremely desperate state where the person just floundered. And even then, it would still make you an armed robber. Whether you have a gun or otherwise, if you're saying you have, you are an armed robber. Now, Brett didn't have a history of violence, and when he was in prison, he acted as a model prisoner. He was basically considered very low risk of reoffending. Couldn't have been more wrong, but nonetheless, this is what they thought. So out of the sentence, he spent 3 years and 9 months behind bars before being released on parole. I guarantee now, in America, there are black guys who are serving huge amounts of years for one armed robbery without a weapon. I guarantee it. There will be white guys as well, please. I appreciate that class is the big divider. If you're poor, if you come from an environment where people look in and think, well, that's the kind of person that's going to be brought up in that kind of place, the bias follows you and you will be legally sentenced because of that bias a great deal. And don't get me wrong, maybe that's right. At the end of the day, if you commit an armed robbery, you probably should be in prison for a long period of time. You're not a safe person, but it is pretty blindsiding that he got 3 years and 9 months before being freed for all those armed robberies. Now, once Brett gets out of prison, he does seek counselling. And during the counselling, the person who's working with him basically says, you need to be more open about your issues because those issues are going to build up. And if you're not telling people the truth, that can spiral. And that's a really good bit of advice. Although, with respect, I don't think any of us should have to pay for that very obvious advice. Just Google it. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? If your lies are getting you into serious trouble, then maybe be more open about the truth and then hopefully the support will be there. Equally, let's just throw in the fact that part of a pathology of a certain mindset is to be a liar. There are people out there with malevolent natures who just lie, because they're not really concerned with the truth. And he could easily fit that paradigm as well. Because like I said, this case is one where pretty privilege certainly plays in. So he's advised to be more open about his issues, but things aren't too easy when he gets out of prison because bear in mind, he'd been a house painter and decorator and he's now out of prison, but he's got a criminal record and it's not for something small, is it? You know, when I'm thinking about having my home decorated, I tend not to be an individual who judges too harshly. But if you were going to give me a list of individuals and on that list there was like, oh, by the way, number 6 on the list of recommendations, Brett. Brett may have had a few issues. What kind of issues? Just a few. What kind of issues though? Are they serious? I mean, the judge didn't think it was too serious. What did the judge think? Well, the judge thought he was an upstanding member of the community and he was youthful, even though he wasn't a youth. That sounds weird. What was he actually charged with? Oh, it was armed robbery. Was it just a one-off? Was it just a slip of his mind and a moment of deep anxiety because of debt? Yeah, I mean, debt played into it, but no, he did it 8 to 12 times. Yeah, I'm going to just knock him off the... Sheila, you shouldn't be recommending armed robbers. You say that, but you should have seen Sandra's exterior wall. It was wonderful, quite charming. Anyway, point is, it's a problem. So due to his financial situation, he ends up having to file for bankruptcy. And understandably, that's going to be very distressing for him because he firstly recognises that life has changed significantly since being in prison, but secondly is now dealing with the repercussions and the reputational damage of being a bank robber. Also, his family has suffered because people know about what Brett's done. So they end up moving from their big family home. And his mum, Sue, actually told her friend, this neighbourhood's bad luck. So they actually ended up downsizing to a post-war bungalow on Lawndale Road in Scarborough. And Sue literally was devoted to just transforming the outside of the new home. So she had quite serious arthritis, but it just didn't stop her. Apparently she worked on it day in and day out, no matter what the weather was, and it was stunning. It was one of those places that just was beautiful to witness. Also, she was afraid of the neighbours finding out about what Brett had done, so she kept the history from all the people that she met, all those new individuals that she came across and encountered. As far as they were concerned, she had 4 amazing boys who were all doing really well. Brett, because he was struggling financially, starts taking jobs in retail. And then with help from his parents, he re-enrolls at the University of Toronto because he wants to pursue a degree in biophysics. Apparently he's also at this point trying to be more open with his family. So to all intents and purposes, he's starting to get back on track, at least from the outside looking in. He's getting it together. Now we get to September 2011 and a really nice thing happens for him. So a friend of Brett sets him up on a blind date with a woman called Kirsten Baxter. And they met for the first time at the corner of York and Queen's Quay, not far from her waterfront condo. She's a physiotherapist. She basically led the kind of life that Brett really wanted. She had the home, she had the cute dog, she's got the career. She also seemed to have this very normal, this really well-adjusted lifestyle. And he was just craving that. He just wanted that. I suppose it was a reflection of what he saw his parents had achieved before they arrived as children, that they'd managed themselves and their lives to a point where they had the family that he'd grown up in. And he can see that within this new relationship, there's a possibility that he could achieve it too. They fall in love relatively quickly and they really enjoyed being with each other. They travelled with each other. They used to love going to tropical islands. And Brett was honest. He told Kirsten about his criminal past, which must have been challenging. Equally, for Kirsten, I imagine it was nowhere near as terrifying as being told, I spent 20 years inside for a criminal past. The truth is, the leniency of the sentence would make Kirsten think it wasn't quite as bad. Without a doubt, you think about the length of a crime with its seriousness and the fact that he got out after 3 years and 9 months. Yes, she'll know it was bad, but nowhere near as bad as you would imagine if somebody was a serious armed criminal robber. But he tells her, and one of the things interesting that he doesn't tell her, however, is that he didn't complete his first university degree. So she believed that he had actually successfully graduated in 2013. And people will ask why. Well, the reason for that is ego. It's not about insecurity. I mean, it's very easy to say insecurity plays in here. But if you're willing to tell somebody about your armed robbery, if you're willing to tell them about your criminalised past, Mostly because you have to, let's be honest, because of limiters that a criminal past will place on you. So arguably he has to tell her this information, particularly if they've got a future together. But it's superiority, it's arrogance, it's ego that means that he doesn't tell her that he didn't graduate. He wants her to believe that he, like her, is an equal when it comes down to academics, which is just untrue. And she would have completely forgiven him because it's only some kind of academic acclaim to succeed at university. It doesn't make the mark of who you are. And she's accepted, as I said, that he'd been an armed robber. Accepting he failed a degree would have been very palatable in comparison to that. We get to 2013 and their relationship is just moving forward. They're really happy together. They move in together and Brett loved living in that condo. It was small, but the view from her condo was amazing. It offered glorious views of the lake beyond the Toronto Islands and he could barbecue on the roof. He could watch the planes land at Billy Bishop Airport. He could swim in the indoor-outdoor pool on the second floor. And it encapsulated a future that he wanted, a foundation that he desired. And it was something that was so alluring to him. It represented a leaving behind of the past and a moving forward through the present into the future that he so desperately wanted. So in 2014, with all this working out, the couple get engaged. He actually proposed to her with a princess cut diamond. It was surrounded by other diamonds. And even though that's beautiful and most girls dream of that moment, the truth is it comes at a price. And it's a price realistically he cannot afford. Again, he's going back to those old methods. He's presenting an image of somebody who's financially sound when really he's falling apart. And we all know that aside from the expense of an engagement ring, when you're going to get married, there is an actual wedding to plan and pay for, and they're expensive. So they end up arranging their wedding for the 16th of September 2016. They booked it at Ancaster Mill, which is an absolutely gorgeous venue, it really is. And it's not cheap. Apparently $100 a setting at the time, so that's a huge amount of money. Brett also planned a bachelor party abroad for the month before the wedding, so he's not cutting back on costs. And the two of them decided they were also going to search for a new home together as newlyweds because the condo was relatively small and clearly they would be looking at the possibility of starting a family. So there's a huge amount of financial pressure now on Brett's shoulders and there's a ticking time bomb because we have a time level that's involved, a pressure. We have a date that he has to have raised the money for the wedding. And remember, Brett is struggling financially at this moment in time, let alone when it comes down to the expense of what I've just discussed. And what do we also know about Brett when it comes down to stressful and pressurized situations with money? Well, he tends to start lying, he tends to start spending, and he tends to detract completely from reality, which has in the past caused absolutely catastrophic conclusions. And unfortunately, this case that I'm covering today, that's the description. Catastrophic conclusions, because that's where we are heading. So with all this playing out, the wedding pressure, life moving forward on one level positively, in another level very negatively, we get to 2015. And at this point, sadly, Bill Ryan, Brett's dad, he dies from cancer. Now, according to people around him, Brett was really compassionate towards his mother, so he took care of her. He was doing odd jobs around the house. Also, he helped her with the life admin. During this same year, he also drops out of the studies that his parents had been helping him with. But again, he starts to go into this world of fantasy. So he pretends that he's attending still. Everybody around him thinks he's still going. And it feels as if that's a sliding doors moment. This is where the spiral of destruction that lies ahead begins to unfold. So now we have an already stressed and pressured Brett dealing with grief on top of all the other things. He's dropped out of uni, he's faking it so everybody around him thinks he's still attending, and he's got this big D-Day where the wedding is concerned. There is a glimmer, however, of hope in May 2016 because all of a sudden he manages to become successful in securing a job in IT. And he must have thought in that moment that his luck had really changed. It was at a turning point. But unfortunately, just a month later, in June of 2016, he lost his job. And the reason for that is his boss discovered that he'd had a criminal record, which he should have actually told the boss beforehand, because clearly you need to make it really obvious if you have been criminalised in the past. Often bosses will do checks, and particularly if you're working with sensitive data, there are issues if you have had a criminal record. It shouldn't mean that you definitely don't get the job, but it's just that the correct checks need to take place should you have been in prison before. But he didn't do that. So when it's discovered, they let him go. And it must have been devastating for him, because he's thinking, wow, finally my life is coming to fruition. Finally, I've got a good job. Finally, I can be proud of myself. Finally, financially, I actually might be able to cope because IT pays well. But all of a sudden, he's on his arse again. Now, instead of just being honest with his fiancée, instead of just going home and saying, you're not going to believe this, my criminal record has meant that they've got rid of me, which she would fully understand. She works as a physiotherapist. She'll know that criminal records can do that. And she knows that he's been criminalised in the past, so it wouldn't be a surprise to her. It'd be sad, but likely she'd fully support him. He just can't do it. So he just hides it from her. He says that he's working from home and that's why he's not going into the office. And it's bizarre because, like I said, Kirsten knew about Brett's time in prison. So she would have been understanding regarding the reason for him losing the job. She would have been probably angry for him. She may have been a little bit frustrated that he hadn't actually been honest about his criminal record with the employer. But aside from that, it's by the by that have moved forward. But of course, now he's lying about all this and the lies are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. He's facing this really big bill regarding the wedding and he's thinking, I can ill afford this playing out. I don't know how to manage this reality. He's got the stag do, he's got the actual event itself, and he's got no money to pay for it. Now, Brett had, as ever, been doing some odd jobs around the house for his mum, and his mum paid him to do that. So he was turning up and getting cash from her, but he was actually using it more as a financial opportunity, a place where he could be dependent of his mother, but actually feel that he was doing something to earn the money. But it's becoming a bit of a burden for her. He's asking for more and more work from her. She doesn't have it. She just lives in a house, not a castle. And actually she's taking care of a lot of things herself. So she's now struggling because she has to pay him for work that she doesn't necessarily even need doing. In addition to this, Brett's brothers, AJ and Leland, they're still living at home with their mother. So financially, that's going to be hard. I don't know what her financial situation was exactly, but her husband had died and she'd been a homemaker. So I don't expect that she had a huge amount of disposable income. And even if she did, it's hers. She shouldn't have to pretend that there's work available for her son because he's not managing his own life financially. So Brett at some point decides, I'm going to have to own up to my mother. I'm going to have to put into practice what the counsellor advised me, which is to be more open and honest about what I'm doing, how I'm feeling, and the messes I'm getting myself into. So he takes that advice, but I'm just thinking maybe you should have done that a little bit earlier. Probably at the point where you dropped out of university. That would have been good to just have admitted it. Because at this point, you've dropped out of university, pretended you were still going. You've got a wedding and a stag do to pay for that you can't afford. You've got a job that you've been fired from that you're still going to. And now you're in a whole hell of a mess. Just going to throw it out there. Truth will set you free, but only usually right at the beginning. When we get into this kind of situation, it's not just an issue with confronting truth. It's an issue with confronting the destruction your lack of truth has caused. So he feels like maybe telling mum is at least the first step in admitting the mess he's in. So he tells her, look, I lost my job because of my previous conviction and I'm in a state. I need money. Now, his mother was sympathetic. She genuinely was, because she understands that the prejudice exists, that people who've got criminal records are not people that you can trust, which isn't true. We all know that lots of people can be criminal in their past and actually go on to lead really effective, positive lives. But she also feels, look, you're about to get married to your fiancé. It is time to grow up. It's time to tell your fiancé the truth. And if you're not willing to tell her, then I'm going to tell her. And I think as parents, we've all been in those situations. Sometimes as parents, the saying, you have to be cruel to be kind, rings true. You love your children, you want what's best for them, they get themselves into situations that they shouldn't be in, and the only way they can manage it is to absolutely take responsibility and accountability. And we will often say, if you don't do it, we will do it for you, because we know that ultimately that will give them the push and the shove they require to actually own up to the situation that they are in. You are helping them, even though they will at the time feel like you're doing quite the opposite. Another reason that she's motivated to do this, of course, will be the money. She doesn't want to give him money constantly, and she can't pay for the wedding. And she's constantly handing out cash to him right now. So she knows that ultimately this is going to end up with her having to give him more and more and more. And that's just not tenable. So at this point, she also uses finances to motivate him to tell his partner and says, look, if you don't tell her, I'm not going to give you any more money. So Brett wanted to tell the truth, as his counsellor had suggested, but didn't necessarily want to deal with the reality of telling the truth, which is tell your fiance, and by the way, you're not having any more money. He's really not happy with that. It's not gone the way that he wished for it to go. So at this point, he's convinced that maybe if he tells his fiance, she'll leave him, and then all that progress, all that future, all that positivity unfolding, it will all be undone. He felt he was so close to achieving his dream, this perfect partner, his hopeful future. And all of a sudden his mother is threatening to take it away from him, even though his mother's doing nothing aside from giving him a reality check. That's the irony. His mother is simply saying, you have to confront this because otherwise everything's going to fall apart. You have time now to rewind the damage, to acknowledge what you've done, and to make your life better. Because it's only going to go in one direction, which is chaos and catastrophe. So she is doing and saying and being exactly as she should do, say, and be. But for him, that pressure, that stress, that time frame, it's not working. And now he's absolutely convinced that everything he's done, everything he's worked for, everything he's created in his personal life is about to be removed. And he is seeing her as the obstacle in his path. So he must be festering over these feelings. And as he's ruminating about what his mother may do, he thinks, I've got to think of a plan. So he decides to buy a weapon. Now, bear in mind, because of his previous conviction, he can't purchase a firearm. So instead, he settles on a crossbow. Because at the end of the day, people with previous armed robbery convictions, for example, people with violent offences in the past, when it comes down to protecting the public, you should be like, you know what? The way to protect the public is they can't buy firearms. Why is that? Well, because we can't have dangerous people with prior convictions, particularly those who do things like bank robberies. We can't have them running around with guns. And what's the reason for that? Because they could kill people, they could harm people, they could wound people. Is there not like a really big list of other things? Well, like what? Well, like knives? Well, I mean, how can we limit knives? I mean, you need those for cutting bread. I know, I just feel like maybe the hunting knives. Well, you know, knives are knives. What about crossbows? I mean, I think you'll find that very few people have ever used crossbows to do bank robberies. I think that's because usually they have guns. Well, exactly. No, I mean, I think that they usually would just take a gun. Well, exactly. Unless they can't because they've not been able to purchase one. So maybe they'd use something like a crossbow. Makes sense. But then what if they want to go hunting with a crossbow? I'm not sure anybody who's armed and dangerous should ever have access to any of these weapons. It's out of my hand, kid. Can't do anything about it. Anyway, apparently dangerous people can get crossbows. So he ends up choosing a Bandit Recruit U30, which is designed for teenage hunters. Maybe what the actual judge said, him being not a youth but youthful, plays out even in what he buys, because it's for teenage hunters. It actually shoots at 140 feet per second. That is an incredible pressure, isn't it? The damage you can do with that. He actually bought it secondhand because he knew he didn't want to leave a trail. So this guy is premeditating what he's going to do. Now, during one of the trips to his mum's, where he's continuing doing these odd jobs, because, yeah, in spite of the fact that she's given him this ultimatum, he's still going there to get cash. And he ends up deciding that he's going to take the crossbow and stash it there. He stashes it in the garage on the top shelf behind some tools. So he's thinking about the fact he might need to use it, because this guy ain't going hunting. It's not like he's out there taking up a new hobby. He's bought that crossbow with intent. He's bought that crossbow to give him an exit if there are no other exits to use. We get to August the 25th, 2016. Brett decides that it's time to have that discussion with his mother. Now, bear in mind, she wasn't actually expecting him at the time, and she is not prepared for his arrival because she'd actually planned to go out with a friend. She had a cold, sadly, so she ended up being in when he arrived. But before he actually leaves to visit his mum, he does some really odd things. So first of all, he dresses in 2 pairs of jeans. He packs a gym bag, and that gym bag, what does it have in it? Well, shall we say it has a very familiar disguise in it. It's got some spare clothes, he's got a wig, a bucket hat, just like the bucket hat he'd worn when he was doing the bank robberies. Also, he took a few broadhead bolts for the crossbow. So why is he taking this to his mum's if he's just going to have a discussion? Also, why does he go to such extreme lengths to make sure that he doesn't get caught on CCTV? So he takes a fire exit, he goes down 14 sets of stairs, and he leaves through a back alley. Hardly the actions of somebody who's just going for a chat. I don't know about you guys, but if I go to my mum's, I'm always thinking, you know what I really want to do in this age of technology? Well, I want to avoid anybody ever knowing that I'm going there. So I'm going to just figure out the CCTV routes. I'm going to go through the exits that mean that I'm caught nowhere. I'm probably going to wear a wig because at the end of the day, no one will recognise it's me. And then I'm also going to arm myself because you don't know who's out there. You don't know who's out there. And so it's always best to have in a backpack a few, I don't know, crossbow heads that can be utilised in some fashion should anybody attack. Particularly if I'm not in an area of CCTV, I'll need to handle it myself because they won't catch them otherwise. All of these things just go through your head on a Wednesday, don't they? Anyway, this is what he does. Bear in mind, we have to consider the intent whenever we're dealing with a crime. So just work it through, just to state on what I'm saying when we're thinking about intent and, shall we say, murder. Because it's very key, isn't it? Why is somebody acting a certain way? Is it because they're in a moment of distress and decline? Or is it because they are cold, calculating, and capable of committing atrocities that you and I could not fathom for a second possible when we consider our own actions? So he goes to these great lengths to ensure that no one knows that he's left the apartment. Then when he arrives at his mum's, as I said, she's not ready for him. She'd got these plans, and obviously she engages in conversation with him. And at this point, he is just attempting desperately to persuade her to help him keep his secret from his fiancée. He's giving her, I suppose, a final chance, a final opportunity to give him the answers that he wants, to help him keep this big secret that his mother is so unhappy with him trying to keep. But it doesn't go well for Brett because Sue has had enough. She wants him to come clean. And the conversation becomes conflictual and argumentative. And Sue actually ends up calling one of her other children, Chris, because she feels it's getting really heated and she's really worried about how this is escalating. And it starts to get worse because it feels as if the violence is at tipping point. So at one point, Brett and Sue both end up making their way into the garage. Bear in mind, Sue has absolutely no idea that her son has preemptively placed a crossbow in the garage. Now, one of the things about crossbows are they're very difficult to load. So he goes over to that weapon and he can't load it itself because he hasn't got the time. So instead, he stabs Susan in the face with the crossbow bolt. That crossbow bolt had 3 sharp serrated blades that formed a point, and he stabbed her in the ear and the cheek. And she was obviously totally stunned and shocked and blindsided by this action. She had no idea this was coming. They fell to the ground. It's all covered in sawdust and they're writhing around. There are flooring pieces that fall from shelves onto her. And then, because she hasn't died and he doesn't have time to load the crossbow because there is this physical altercation going on between them, he ends up strangling her to death, his own mother, with a piece of yellow nylon. Talk about escalation, but also just put it into the context that we're dealing with here. This is a woman who is paid for her son, who has protected him in more ways than most would ever manage. And yet, because she refused to continue and perpetuate a lie that he told, that she didn't tell, that he told, The consequence is she's been brutalised and now strangled to death by her own son. A son she loved, financially supported, and cared for deeply. And it's only going to get worse. Because as I said, she's called Chris during the argument, so Brett's eldest brother is on his way and he soon arrives to help deal with the situation. He's been really concerned after receiving the phone call from his mother, but bear in mind, Brett knows he's coming, so he's had time. So he stood out of sight, he'd cocked the crossbow. And as Chris enters the garage, totally unaware, Brett positions himself behind him and fires the crossbow through his neck, so that the blades ended up in his mouth. Now this, fortunately, would have been an almost instant death. Bear in mind the crossbow had such power, it was fired at incredibly close range. He might not even have realised that his brother was about to attack him before he was killed. It could just have happened in such an instant. I hope it did. Brett then placed his mother's and brother's body together with his brother's body on top of his mother's, dragging him across the floor to do that. He then covered them both up with tarp. There was so much blood in the garage, also all over Brett's clothes at this point. However, this isn't going to end the bloodshed. The situation's going to get even further out of hand because AJ ends up coming home unexpectedly. So Brett had been prepared for Chris, but he wasn't prepared for AJ. So Brett goes out, meets AJ on the driveway. Of course, AJ's looking at Brett and thinking, what the hell's happened? His brother's covered in blood. They end up having an altercation. It becomes a fight. They're scuffling with each other. But bear in mind, Brett is armed. He had a crossbow bolt in his hand and he uses it, plunging it into AJ's neck. The commotion caused by Brett's fight with AJ also wakes up Leyland. So Leyland has been unaware that this has all been playing out. He's been sleeping in his room. So he goes outside to investigate what on earth is happening and he finds his youngest brother just bleeding out on the driveway. He recognises he's still alive. He sees him dragging himself across the floor and he quickly runs inside at this point to call the emergency services. But Brett tailed Leyland. He begins to fight with him. Leyland fought hard. He fought for his life, but he's wounded in the process. Leyland does actually make it to his mother's friend's home, Warren and Marie. They were neighbours. Warren said he heard this frantic hammering on his front door. And when he answered, he just sees Leyland fall into his arms and he's covered in blood. Now, despite the fact he'd been attacked by Brett, despite the fact he had this really bad head injury, he'd managed to, as I said, escape and run for help. And the neighbour said that Leyland immediately asked him to call the police. He said, "Call 911, my brother's bleeding in the driveway." Then he apparently stumbled into the living room, collapsed on the floor and just passed out. Though paramedics rushed to provide immediate assistance, AJ sadly died after they'd arrived. And Brett, who's just there, covered in blood, he shouts to the paramedics that he should have driven him to the hospital. Or throwing out there, Brett, maybe you just shouldn't have fatally wounded him in the first place. I mean, how about that? How about that? Maybe you wouldn't have had to drive him to the hospital if you hadn't stabbed him. Maybe that would have been a better chain of events to occur. Police, of course, know that something terrible's happened, so they quickly attend the scene and they find AJ dead on the driveway of the Ryan family home. They can also see Brett just standing by the garage, he's soaked in blood. And the police think, my God, he's injured. So they offer help to him and he says, "No, it's not my blood." And there are two more in the garage. He said, "The guys in the garage are dead. Crossbow to the head. It was me." So he confesses to the murders immediately. He'd waited for the police to arrive and he'd actually been and got a bottle of water from the fridge at the time. So he was just calmly waiting for them to do what they were going to do. He knew the authorities were coming for him. He knew there was no escape, so he didn't try to. At this point, Brett is taken into custody. He's banged to rights, isn't he? It's all gone horribly wrong. Whatever his plans were, whatever he premeditated, it's played out in the most gruesome of ways. They treat him for some wounds because he'd presumably sustained those in the fight with his brothers. And once he's good to go, he's charged. Brett actually hired John Rosen, the Toronto criminal lawyer who's known as, quote, Mr. Murder. Just going to throw it out there. I don't think it's a good thing, is it? Is it a good thing to be a criminal lawyer? You know, when you think about monikers What's your moniker? Oh, I'm called the Justice Warrior Lawyer. I like that. What about yours? I'm called Truth Will Always Prevail. Oh, I like that one. What about you? Ms. Justice. Oh, sounds like a Marvel hero. It does. I like it. I think sometimes I should have had one of those suits made as well, but apparently the judges aren't au fait with wearing them in court. No, I can kind of understand that. I can too. I'm just saying it would look good. I've got a great figure for it. What about you? Mr. Murder. Yeah, I'm called Mr. Murder. What? Mr. Murder. That doesn't sound like heroic. That sounds like you're Mr. Murder, like you're somebody who literally is murder, that you are Mr. Murder, like you are literally murder and you're known as Mr. Murder. Yeah, I love it. Are you evil? No. Do you represent really bad people? Some people would say. I just say they're innocent until proven guilty. I'm just going to go off now in my Mr. Murder cloak. Anyway, John Ronson, Mr. Murder, had quite a long record of defending accused killers, including Paul Bernardo. Also members of the Drangheta organised crime family. So obviously, guy who's got some contacts, if nothing else. So he employs him because I would imagine he thinks he's going to be a pretty effective defender. And Brett did actually waive the standard preliminary inquiry. He pled guilty. And I imagine that's very good sense because there's no way he was ever going to get away with it. And we always like somebody who'll say, I take some responsibility and accountability. Although, let's be clear, when it comes down to accountability and responsibility, often people will do that when it's obvious that they committed the crime because it just looks better for them. Now, Brett pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of his mother, Sue, who was 66 years of age, which I cannot comprehend because if you think about what I've talked about so far, it's just premeditated as far as I'm concerned. So he argues that he only intended to threaten her with the crossbow. Yeah, you know what I mean. I just decided I wanted to just threaten her with a crossbow. What was that going to achieve? Well, she just have some light threatening. Just some light threatening with a crossbow. I don't know whether there's anything that's light about threatening somebody with a crossbow. She didn't think it was either. She wasn't okay with the crossbow. Honestly, this is ludicrous, but let's just go down it. We have to cover the cases as they are. So he argues that he hadn't actually intended to kill her with the crossbow that he'd hid in the garage, that he'd gone to when she wasn't giving him his own way. No, he just wanted to lightly threaten her with it. Now, the first degree murder was of his brother, Chris. Chris was 42 years of age when he died. And the reason for that is obviously he hid for him, waited for him before murdering him. He then got charged with the second degree murder of AJ, who was 29 years of age at the time because AJ had startled him. So he'd murdered him by mistake, I imagine he's trying to say. Now, as this murder occurred in the heat of the moment, that's why, arguably, he's going to be able to plead this, taking him by surprise. So, didn't have any other option. Didn't have any other option. He'd taken me by surprise. What if everybody kept taking you by surprise, Brett? What if there was just like neighbour after police officer after ambulance person? They all took me by surprise. I just had to repeatedly kill them because they all took me. That's just a mass murderer. It's just throwing it out there. The court and the legal system is bonkers at certain points, isn't it? But apparently he was taken by surprise, so there was no other option than to kill him. Brett had also, which again blows my mind when it comes down to these charges, because he's saying that he didn't intend to kill. So bear that in mind, he didn't intend to kill. So if he didn't intend to kill, think about the 14 flights of stairs he went down. Think about avoiding CCTV. Think about the disguise kit. That in itself, for me, is enough. But he'd also created this sophisticated plan to fabricate an alibi for himself during the time of the murder. So this involved bizarre, intricate methods. So he wanted to create digital footprints for himself so that when the killings were taking place, he was using the internet. Because clearly, if you are using the internet at the times of the killings and they can't place you because you've not been spotted on CCTV, it's going to give you an alibi. Like I said, he did this in a very intricate manner. He'd thought this out. So he had opened his laptop and had basically propped it against the wall with 2 5-pound weights. Then, I kid you not, he duct taped a wooden spoon to a black cylindrical oscillating fan and placed it so the tip of the spoon lined up with the laptop's enter key. He then plugged the cord into a digital timer, so when the timer was activated, the fan would turn on and the spoon would click on a cursor hovering over an icon that would open YouTube. And then he used 2 portable fans plugged into digital timers and screwed into a wooden board, which he placed on the kitchen island. He then taped styluses, I kid you not, to the casings of the fans when the timers went off, so that the fans would turn on. Basically, the intention being that the styluses would then tap the phone and tablet, and each would send a pre-written message, one thanking a friend for a real estate tip and the other for a home repair. So the timers were also rigged to go off at various points in the afternoon, and the devices were set so that they wouldn't go to sleep. I mean, that doesn't sound premeditated at all. I just wanted to go over to lightly threaten my mother with a crossbow. Why did you set up all that technology to make it seem like you were at home? Well, I just thought that lightly threatening her with a crossbow may be something that's not okay, and she might want to tell the authorities. So essentially, I just had all of that set up at home so that it made her look like a liar. I think it's because you wanted to kill them. You can say that, but I think you'll find I'm not a youth, but I'm youthful. And in my childish mind, I just thought it would all be fine. Just a little bit of light threatening with a crossbow, and also carrying those crossbow bolts in my pocket, and also murdering most of my family. I mean, at the end of the day, these things happen. Genuinely, it's so premeditated, it blows my mind. This is why I don't understand the second-degree charges, because whoever you're going to murder, you've set things up so you have the opportunity and time to do so. And he's elaborately created this ruse so it makes it look like he's at home when the killings occur. However, we don't know why, but the devices didn't actually get activated, so essentially the plan failed. No emails were sent, no videos were actually played, but he obviously believed that they would. The fact that he sets those up means that those murders were premeditated, at least his mother's. And I suppose one could argue he might have thought that things could have been resolved a different way, but definitely he anticipated there was a possibility he'd need an alibi, and nobody who is going into a situation innocently needs an alibi. And in addition to this, remember, he took that change of clothes, he avoided being spotted, as I said, by the CCTV in his apartment building as he was leaving. That indicates premeditation of his mother's murder every day of the week. Now, I get that the defence can argue that he hoped that she'd agree to lie for him and then he wouldn't have killed her if things had been resolved this way. But how is she going to do that? Because she would have known that the truth was going to out. So it was very unlikely she would have ever agreed to that. When it came down to Brett being sentenced, well, he likes a bit of an audience, does our Brett. So he spoke at the sentencing. He was crying. He was apologising for his actions. He was like, I can only begin to say how sorry I am for what I've done. He said he was sick with grief, though he couldn't imagine what his friends and surviving brother were going through. So even though he's sick with grief, he can't even begin to envisage how they're feeling. Well, I imagine they're feeling significantly worse than you are, Brett, because you murdered them. You murdered your family, and now the surviving parties and your friends who so believed in you have to manage the fact that they were with a monster. Simple as that. He then said, the time now doesn't belong to me, but I'll make the most of every opportunity I'm afforded. He promised to everyone for all of this, I'm very sorry. Is it just me, guys? The word sorry really doesn't cut it. The word sorry doesn't really feel appropriate in this case. He also commented that he couldn't imagine what Leyland, his surviving brother, was now experiencing. Well, trauma. Horrendous heaps of trauma, Brett, because you murdered his family. What blows my mind is that, as we have heard in the first case, where, the judge really liked the way he looked, thought that he was a good guy, things had just gone wrong for him. It seems that this judge feels similarly. So this judge expressed admiration for Brett's presentation in court. He complimented his elocution, his sincerity, his willingness to be accountable for his deeds. He actually determined that Brett was not just the author of this tragedy, but one of its victims. A good man who'd done something extraordinarily heinous. Brett had been caught in a simple web of lies. McMahon, the judge, concluded this: I have no hesitation that Mr. Ryan is remorseful for his actions. Can somebody please go and get both the judges who seem to look at this man who has done the most despicable crimes that are in line with what we see serial killers do. And yet, because he looks a certain way, because he sounds a certain way, because class-wise he doesn't fit their bias and stereotype, somehow he just feels really bad about it and we should all have sympathy with him. He had absolutely no sympathy with his victims. At the end of the day, Brett executed them. For what? For his lies. For their generosity. Just because that generosity had an end when his mother said, you're going to have to tell the truth, and by the way, I can't fund your lifestyle. That's why they were murdered. And here we have a judge saying, what a great guy he is. It reminds me of the judge who summed up Ted Bundy's case, where he was like, oh, you know, you'd have been great if you'd just gone down the legal route. Well, he didn't go down the legal route. He went down the serial killer route. It's ludicrous. Because somebody looks a certain way, people assume all these positives towards them, and it's BS. So Brett ends up receiving concurrent life sentences for each of the murderers, plus 10 years for the attempted murder of Leyland. He will be eligible for parole in 2041. He'll be 60 years of age. Now, just put it into context now. 60 years of age, you might have another 40 years of freedom. People make it to 100 all the time these days. He might have 40 years, fall in love, have a life, be funded by the taxpayer, etc. Certainly have a future that he afforded none of his victims. How is this guy, for the brutalised murders that I've just described, the butchering murders that I've just described, how is he going to get parole potentially in 2041? And this guy will, because we know he behaves really well when he's inside. He murdered his mother and two brothers and traumatised and would have happily killed the other. All because he couldn't tell the truth? That was the motivation? Or because he was worried that his fiancée discovered the web of lies she'd call off the wedding? The fact that he gets 3 life sentences and he'll be out for 60 potentially is just insane as far as I'm concerned. To be eligible for parole after 25 years seems bizarre. It's so lenient when you consider the extent of his crimes. And to put this in context, if he had been charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, he would have had to wait 75 years before there would have been an opportunity for parole. So he would have certainly died in prison. This sentence means he genuinely does have a chance of being released. And that is staggering. Justice John McMahon said that the case was extremely tragic. I mean, that's a bit of an underestimation when it comes down to the tragedy in this case. He said, this entire family has been destroyed by a web of lies, which again is a lie. Sorry, Judge. At the end of the day, this family have been destroyed by a man with a crossbow. That's the reality of it. The underplaying of this case by the legal system is absolutely astonishing. And believe me, you could go online right now and you could look at 100 cases that involve one murder where an individual has got an entire life term. The very fact that we're dealing with 3 members of the same family being executed in such a gory fashion, and for some reason, because this guy's blonde and goofy looking and kind of cute, that means that we can forgive the actions to some degree, see it as just one moment of madness, as opposed to an absolute premeditated cold killing of a beautiful family. Now, there's Leyland who survived, of course. The sad reality of that poor man's experience, the way that that life has changed must just be incomprehensible for him. And even though he hasn't openly talked about what's played out for him, what he has said is that he literally has been traumatized beyond belief by the experience, and he can't get the mental image of AJ just dying on the driveway out of his mind. He said he just had to watch him take his last breaths as he was bleeding out. And understandably, Leyland now struggles to sleep, struggles to concentrate. He doesn't like to leave the house. He suffers from extreme anxiety because he has severe PTSD without a doubt. And I imagine that PTSD is made even more complex by the fact that his brother caused him the agony and anguish. And the fact that that brother did so for something so minuscule. So what if your girlfriend finds out that you've lied? So what if you get sacked from a job? So what if they find out that you dropped out of university? So what? Your charade is nothing extreme enough to create this kind of chaos and catastrophe. But Brett chose to create this chaos and catastrophe. And the idea that somehow this man was just somebody who lost his mind for a short period of time because he created this web of lies, as opposed to this man being a cold, calculating, disturbing killer, is blindsiding to me. A family friend of Ryan's fiancée, Kirsten, who's also a victim in this, said that she had basically crumbled into a million pieces. This is weeks before what would have been the happiest day of her life. And we have to remember that she's a victim too. Imagine realizing to your horror that you have been sharing your life with somebody with this capacity. Because if he had the potential to kill his mother, the woman who birthed him, his brothers, the men who loved him, then he could have easily killed you too. And she must have to live that burden on a daily basis. I'd love to know your thoughts on this case. Basically, my big question to you is pretty privilege in this crime part of the reasoning for this lenient sentence? Or do you believe that Brett was a victim of circumstance, a man who created this intricate web of lies and felt he was so fractured on a self-esteem level that he just couldn't live up to others' expectations and finally it broke him down? Or do you believe, like I do, that he's simply a cold-blooded killer? Let me know your thoughts, guys. And as ever, see you again next time. Be safe.